Good morning to all. Can you hear me? Great. My name is Yves Sciama. I'm the president of the French Association of Science Journalists, AJSPI, and I'm the co-chair of the program committee of this conference. And it's my pleasure today to introduce and moderate the discussion with Naomi Oreskes, who is professor of history of Science at Harvard University. So my first interaction with Naomi goes back to 2008. That was even before she wrote Merchants of Doubt. I interviewed her for a French monthly called La Recherche. And I remember that episode very vividly because we climate journalists were at the time struggling with a group of influential climate skeptics, I should say climate deniers, who were given a lot of attention in the mainstream media. They were saying the usual outrageous things, for example, that the sun was warming the climate, and that the climate was not warming anyway. It was all a plot by climate scientists to get research money. And we were having a hard time with these people because the leader of that group was a very powerful scientist called Claude Allègre, who was a former minister of research. He was very vocal, he had huge networks, he was at the Academy of Sciences. And we didn't really know what to do against these people in that magazine. And my editor at the time, Hélène, who is sitting there on the first row, said, well, maybe we should call this historian of science who has published a few interesting papers on this and set up an interview. And so I called Naomi, and I really didn't know what to expect. I didn't know her work very well, and it was quite an amazing interview because it turned out that she knew the French situation very well, in great detail, which is not so common with American scholars, I can tell you. And also at the time they had plenty on their own plate with climate deniers, so I didn't expect anybody to know the French situation. And not only did she know the situation, but she knew the people individually in very great detail. So she gave me this interview, which was absolutely great. She explained the denial phenomenon in a very articulate, easy to understand way. And also she gave me all these mean little nasty quotes that we love so much as journalists. For example, I remember that she said that Claude Allègre was one of those aging scientists who really loved media attention and could find no other way to get it than actually say outrageous things scientifically. And you know, it's really a pleasure to print those things. And it was actually perfectly true, so I felt even better printing it. So I'm not saying that if you have a problem with a vocal science denier, you should call Naomi. She would get way too many calls and that she can handle. But on a more serious note, I think that her work is very useful for us science journalists. She has been exploring for years the way corporation and industry distort science in various fields, the way they defend their interests by actually acting on the scientific process. And honestly, I would say that if I had one book that I would like to recommend to young science journalists coming into the trade, that book would be Merchants of Doubt, that she wrote in 2010. To me, for journalists in our times, it's really an essential book. And by the way, Naomi tells me that it's going to have a new edition next year to celebrate its 10th birthday. So if you want to refresh your memory, you will have an opportunity to do so. And I think the introduction is by Al Gore. Anyway, I know that the best way to convince you that Naomi is useful to our profession is just to give her the floor. So without any further ado, Naomi, please give us your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just need to go over here and get my clicker. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. and reminding me that I'm a lot older than I was when we first met. So, as Yves just told you, in 2010, Eric Conway and I wrote the book Merchants of Doubt. Can I ask the technical people, can we make this clock smaller so I can see my whole slide? Is that possible? If not, I'll manage. In any event, Eric Conway and I wrote the book Merchants of Doubt, which tells the story of how a small band of right-wing scientists, aided and abetted by the fossil fuel industry, by libertarian think tanks, and the business media, promoted doubt about a whole set of environmental and public health issues, beginning with tobacco and the harms of tobacco, running through nuclear winter, acid rain, the ozone hole, and the mother of all environmental issues, climate change. We were lucky enough to be able to work with a filmmaker, Robbie Kenner, the filmmaker who made the documentary film Food, Inc., and to turn our book into a film in 2004. Sadly, as Yves just said, our story is still relevant. I would really like to be not relevant and no longer useful so that I could retire and hike and climb mountains, but unfortunately the world isn't giving me that opportunity. So we do have a 10th anniversary book coming out next year, so I hope if you haven't read it that you will. I'm sorry that it's still relevant, but it is. So what I thought I would do today, one of the benefits of having a film is that you can, journalists always say, show, don't tell. So I can show you in 2 short film clips a couple of essential points about the film. So I want to start with one clip that shows you the basic storyline that gives you a sense of who these people are and what the strategy is that they use to cast doubt upon established science. So this is Bill O'Keefe, and he's about to be introduced. He was the head of the American Petroleum Institute, so here we are.
Bill O'Keefe is Executive Vice President of the American Petroleum Institute. He's also a board member of the Global Climate Coalition, made up of oil and electric companies, automakers, and others.
We believe it was a war on oil. They had an off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that.
I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted and misstated. And without
the science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. And so maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
There is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment to respond.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us, the way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
So there you have it in a nutshell. The key idea was to create the impression of scientific debate, to say we don't really know, we need more data, the science is very complicated, there's natural variability that has nothing to do with man, and climate is changing naturally, and of course the CO2 is good for you. Now, in some cases, the science is unsettled, but in this case, all of these claims were being made well after the scientific community had concluded that we really did know. In the film, we see John Pasacatando, who was an environmentalist who worked in the 80s for a group called Ozone Action that had worked on the ozone hole. And in the film clip, he compares the strategy that the fossil fuel industry is using to the previous claims of the tobacco industry, who claimed that luckies make you healthy, which in fact they did. But what we found in our research, the important kind of the big reveal that we discovered, was it wasn't just an analogy. It wasn't just that this argument was like the tobacco argument, it was that many of the key people involved had in fact worked for or with the tobacco industry. It was the same people, the same PR agencies, the same advertising agencies, and the same strategies and tactics. So one of the questions we wanted to answer when we wrote this book was, why was this ever seen as credible? Already in the 90s, you had this large body of scientific work saying that climate change was happening, that it wasn't natural variability that was being driven by greenhouse gases. And yet somehow this story, this argument, seemed credible, particularly to folks like you, to journalists. And so how did former shills for the tobacco industry, that guy Bonner Cohen, the one who goes, we need more data, he said he worked for the tobacco industry, said the same things about tobacco. How did these former industry shills make their case for doubting climate change credible? How did they get on television? So one of the key strategies they used was what in this talk I'm referring to as fabricated controversy, to make the whole thing seem controversial, to make it seem contested, even though in the scientific community it wasn't. And they did this through the use of fake science, or what in the book we call Potemkin village science. They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is the mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout and design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report.
So
the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
And how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same.
It's
the same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness. So.
Okay, I know you guys are still all asleep because normally people laugh at that, but it's all right. I'll try to wake you up. Okay, so some of you may recognize the man holding the two reports, the mirror image reports. That's Michael Shermer, who is a science writer and the editor of Skeptic magazine, which, as you may know, is a very pro-science magazine. But ironically, he himself was a former skeptic who came around. And in the clip, you heard him say, if you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this, the real scientific report put out by NOAA, and this, the fake scientific report put out by the Cato Institute? Now, Shermer's right. That Cato Institute report did land on the desks of many US congressmen and other government officials, and no doubt they were confused by it. But the actual primary target was not congressmen, it was actually journalists. Our research showed that the centerpiece of the strategy of selling doubt was to target journalists to tell both sides of the story. Because if you could get journalists to tell both sides, then the American people would get the message that we didn't really know. And so they worked by exploiting the journalistic ideals of fairness, objectivity, and particularly the ideal of balance. To manipulate journalists into presenting what was essentially propaganda, what we would now call fake news or alternative facts, as the other side of a science story. Not as a political story or an economic story, but as the other side of a science story, when in fact, it wasn't science at all. And sadly, it worked. There has been for many years, and even in some quarters still continues to be, extensive coverage of climate denial and skepticism, particularly in the business media, magazines like Forbes and Fortune, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, the Business Investor's Daily, but not only the business media. In 2004, Max and Jules Boykoff published a very important paper, which if you haven't read it is kind of a must-read, along with Merchants of Doubt, in which they analyzed the way the prestige media in the United States, so now we're talking about not the Wall Street Journal, but the New York Times, well, I think the Journal was part of this, but the New York Times, the Washington Post, reputable outlets that were not necessarily considered ideologically driven, and asked the question, how were they treating their coverage of climate change? Were they presenting the dominant story of climate science, or were they presenting a balanced presentation in which the scientific views were juxtaposed with these contrarian or skeptical positions? And what they found in their analysis was that more than half of news articles offered a balanced coverage of the issue, giving equal weight to the unscientific position that anthropogenic climate change was not underway. Only about a third of the articles were consistent with the scientific position, and this is in the context of discussing science. Now, they published their paper in 2004. As it happened, I published my paper on the scientific consensus of climate change in that same year. And this was the first ever quantitative analysis of the scientific consensus, which documented that there was, in fact, a scientific consensus on the reality of anthropogenic climate change. But it was 9 years after the IPCC had declared that man-made climate change was underway. So when Max was doing his analysis, Max and Jules, obviously I didn't expect journalists to have known about my paper, since my paper hadn't yet come out. But this is 9 years after the second assessment report of the IPCC, which had said, quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate." So the press coverage was very discordant compared to where the scientific community was, what the scientific community had attempted to communicate. Now, if we look at the coverage in relation to time, we find something even more important. So this is a graph in which they analyzed the data from 1988 to 2002. I have a, oh, sorry. No, well, okay. I'm supposed to be able to get a pointer out of this. Oh, there we go. Okay, so, well, that's a little weird. I think I'll just talk. Anyway, the top line shows accounts that give balanced coverage. So that's this one up here, right? So what you see is more than half, or throughout this period, about half of the papers, but the dominant media framework is this framework of balance, equal weight to the scientific conclusions versus the skeptical conclusions. But what's particularly interesting, if you look at the timing here, is, so this is 1990 here, so 1988 is when the IPCC was created. This is 1992, that's the year of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you might have thought in that context that the scientific position would come to the fore, but actually it's the opposite. We see more balancing of the coverage at the time of the UN Framework Convention, and then it drops off a little bit, but then we have this whole period here between sort of 92 and 95, and this line here, sorry, this pointer's a little weird, but these are the ones where it's consistent with the science, that the anthropogenic contribution is, look at this. As the science is getting stronger and coalescing around the time of the second assessment report here, the coverage is becoming more out of sync with what the scientific community is saying. And that's consistent with the idea that these contrarian efforts were having an effect, because the contrarian story really kicks in. It begins in the late 80s when the IPCC is created, but it really kicks in that period from 92 to 97 when the UN Framework Convention is passed and the Kyoto Protocol is proposed. Oh, sorry, I guess I didn't realize I had another slide that's better on this. Okay, sorry, I didn't need my pointer. I already put in an arrow. So there you go. The arrow points to where you see this drop in what I would consider to be scientifically accurate coverage, right as the science is actually becoming clear. Now, I know this can be a tricky thing to talk to journalists about, because I know a lot of journalists, probably all journalists, pride themselves on their objectivity. But this evidence strongly points to the successful manipulation of the media by the merchants of doubt, who succeeded in getting their framework of a controversy. That framework became the dominant framework in the media during this time period. And it also suggests, the evidence also suggests that this had an effect, that the American people were deeply influenced by this. If we go back to 2007, the Yale Project on Climate Change worked with the Gallup polling organization to investigate American opinions about this question. And in 2007, they found that 72% of Americans were completely or mostly convinced that global warming was happening. This is actually a very scary statistic, because that's about what it is now. And the last few years, everybody's been boasting about how great it is because the American people now finally realize that climate change is real. But actually, they knew it more than 10 years ago. But in the interim, the numbers fell dramatically, and they've only just recently recovered. But here's the other really important thing. At the same time that 72% of Americans thought that climate change was happening, nearly half of them thought that there was a lot of scientific disagreement about it. So the argument that we didn't really know, that we needed more data, that scientists were arguing, clearly convinced just about half of the American people. 41% of Americans thought that warming could be mostly or explained entirely by natural variability. So that mantra about natural variability clearly got through. And then a few years later, this strategy was picked up by the Republican Party leadership. And of course, it received heavy news coverage because, as we know, and we're seeing this right now, it's very difficult for the news media not to quote the President of the United States or the Vice President of the United States, even when they're spouting complete nonsense. So here's an example of ABC News quoting Vice President Dick Cheney again in 2007. I think there's an emerging consensus that we do have global warming. Where there does not appear to be any consensus is to the extent to which that's part of a normal cycle versus the extent to which it's caused by man, greenhouse gases, etc. So obviously that was completely erroneous because the scientific community, the question that the scientific community was addressing in the IPCC was never about global warming just as who knows what it is. It was always about the question of whether it was anthropogenic. And by 2007, we had not just the second assessment report, but the third and the fourth, all of which said that climate change was being driven by human activity. So why did this work? Why did journalists accept this framework and consistently repeat claims that scientists had shown were false? Well, as I said, a lot of this was done by appealing to journalistic ideals of fairness and balance. But it wasn't just sort of a general appeal. There were some very specific things that these people did. So they wrote many letters to editors, and I don't mean like a public letter to the editor, I mean actually like a private letter to an editor, stressing the importance of telling both sides of the story. And they resorted both to positive encouragement, but also to pressure and intimidation. So I want to give you one example of this strategy that we have very good historical evidence for that involves not climate change, but an earlier episode that many climate change deniers were involved in, including some of the people that I've studied in great detail. So one of these people was Robert Jastrow. Some of you, if you've worked in the history of astronomy or space science, may know that name. He was a very prominent figure in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. He was an astrophysicist. He wrote a number of popular books on astronomy. He was an old Earth creationist. He wrote a book called God and the Astronomers that was a best-selling book arguing for the argument from design that the heavens are indeed telling the glory of God. And he was radically anti-communist, radically right-wing. In 1984, Jastrow teamed up with two other Cold War physicists, Fred Seitz and Bill Nierenberg, to create the George C. Marshall Institute. And they're a centerpiece of our story in Merchants of Doubt. But the Marshall Institute wasn't created originally to fight climate change, although that became their dominant activity after about 1989. It was started initially to defend the Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan's proposal to put laser-based weapons in space and to use this to create a missile shield to protect the United States and Western Europe from a possible Soviet attack. There was widespread opposition in the American scientific community to SDI, and it was led by some very prominent, very famous, and in one case, very telegenic scientists, Carl Sagan, but also the great physicist Hans Bethe. But in addition to these famous scientists who sort of led the public face of the opposition to SDI, thousands of American physicists and computer scientists had signed a pledge not to accept funds from the SDI program and not to work on SDI because it would be politically destabilizing. Jastrow's goal was to counter the publicity that these scientists had achieved and to create the impression that support of SDI was just as strong among scientists as opposition. Now, this was factually untrue, but they would make this argument, they would create this impression by writing letters to editors, opinion pieces, specifically initially targeting conservative venues like commentary in the Wall Street Journal. But once they had made an inroad with these conservative venues, then used that to branch out into broader, more mainstream venues. And they would pressure and even threaten the media if they did not give equal time to the pro-SDI position. So in 1986, they developed a strategy plan along these lines. Public broadcasting in the United States planned to air a program that was focused on the physicists' opposition to SDI. Jastrow, on Marshall Institute letterhead, sent a letter to every single public television station in the United States threatening a lawsuit if the program were aired. And he wrote, This program presents only one side of a matter of great national import. Stations that aired the program could incur obligations under the fairness doctrine to provide airtime for presentation of contrasting viewpoints. So what was the result? Jastrow later boasted to his colleagues, very few public television stations aired the program. So a kind of censorship out of fear and intimidation. They were very happy that this tactic worked, and so they continued it, writing, "We intend to continue monitoring the use of public television for presentation of one-sided programs on technical issues affecting national security." Now, ironically, as many of you may know, the fairness doctrine was repealed in 1987, so the very next year, under pressure from many of the same libertarian think tanks who would later promote climate disinformation. But even though the doctrine was formally repealed in law, the ideal of fairness as equal time lived on, and it was exploited then in subsequent years by climate deniers, including Jastrow and his colleagues, but also many others, to obtain airtime and print space for their side of the scientific story. And we have many examples of this now in climate reporting that have been documented by me and many other people. So we know that there has been pressure on editors to cover the skeptical perspective. And I just want to make the point, I really hate the word skeptical because, of course, these people are not skeptics at all. A skeptic wants evidence, and scientists have provided it in bucket loads of thick reports. But as we saw in that film clip, the deniers have responded by supplying their own equally thick reports and then complaining if their reports don't get equal coverage. And this is one of the reasons they make their reports equally thick, partly to make them look like the real report, but also to give the impression or to be able to support a claim that they have just as much evidence on their side as the scientists do. They've issued press releases timed with major IPCC and other government reports, which often then have been reported by mainstream media as the other side of the story. And I'll give you one example from my own personal experience. Some years ago, I did an interview at Voice of America, and I was actually pretty pleased that Voice of America was interested in talking to a historian of science, and the interview went well. I was happy with it, the journalist was happy, and it aired. But a few days later, I received a very concerned message on my voicemail, and the reporter asked me to please call him back as soon as possible. I called him back, and he was quite upset. He was being pressured by his editor because his story was viewed as not being balanced. And he told me that his editor wanted him to do a second interview. And he didn't know why this was happening, and he wanted to know if I had any idea. And I said, oh yeah, of course I had not just an idea, I know why this is happening. And I explained this whole strategy, and I talked about how, for example, the Cato Institute was one of the organizations that often did this, and they promoted a particular person, this climate denier named Patrick Michaels, and the journalist replied to me, oh, that's who complained, and that's who I'm being told I have to interview. And he did. So what do we do? How do we respond to this difficult situation? Obviously, we do want to be fair, and we do want to be objective, but what I want to argue is that fairness and objectivity are not the same as balance. I want to ask you all, absolutely in no uncertain terms, to reject the concept of balance in science writing and science reporting, because the world is not balanced, and life is not balanced, and science is definitely not balanced. And if you insist on balance in your reporting, you will succumb to false equivalence, equating factual information, well-verified, tested scientific results with disinformation and spin. And more often than not, it will yield a story that is inaccurate and misleading. So I want to argue that our goals as historians, as journalists, as scientists, is always to be accurate. And we need to think about what frameworks aid accuracy, and balance isn't one of them. But the problem especially is that the ideal of balance is consciously exploited by PR agents and propaganda networks to get disproportionate coverage for minority views, misinformation, and in some cases even outright lies. Sometimes the truth, the evidence, and the facts are mostly or even entirely on one side. And when journalists accept balance as a framework, it leads individually to inaccurate and misleading stories, and overall to very misleading coverage of an issue and public disinformation misunderstanding. And as Boykoff and Boykoff argued, it leads to bias against mainstream views. So that was the title of their paper, Balance as Bias, that when you try to balance your story, you end up actually biasing it in favor of minority or outlier opinions. And in science, that often means a bias against the truth. Now, I want to acknowledge that the framework of two sides makes sense in some contexts, definitely makes sense in a soccer match. It may make sense in a political debate in a two-party political system, but it doesn't make sense in science. In science, if a question is unresolved, if the science is not settled, if a consensus has not yet emerged in the scientific community, well, then there may be many theories and perspectives. In my first book on the history of continental drift, I have a diagram that came out of a classroom notes. Continental drift was highly controversial, unsettled in the 1920s and 30s, and a very famous professor at Caltech taught the subject and listed 13 different possible hypotheses for mountain building. So in live and active science, there's usually more than two sides. But when a matter is resolved, then in many cases, there really only is one answer. There's really only one answer to the age of the Earth. There's really only one answer to the question of whether anthropogenic climate change is underway. And that answer is what we conventionally call truth. And speaking of soccer, so in the recent coverage of the wonderful USA-UK women's match, sorry if anyone English is here, I didn't see anyone reporting that result, that the US beat England 2-1 to advance to the finals, but then also quoting a spokesman for England claiming, well, no, actually it was England who won. You wouldn't do that in a sports match. In a soccer match, we would know that that would be nonsense. So why didn't journalists know it was nonsense when ExxonMobil CEO Lee Raymond suggested that climate change was caused by the wobble of the Earth? We knew that wasn't true, and yet it was reported in many newspapers, shown on television, on the radio. Well, admittedly, reporting on the causes of climate change is more complex than reporting on the outcome of a soccer match. But this is why it's essential to think really hard about your sources and who you're quoting. And it's essential to quote scientists on science, and not politicians or representatives of think tanks or the CEOs of fossil fuel companies. Real science comes from scientists. Now, of course, the propaganda machines know this, so we have to go dig one layer deeper. Because one of the things they often do is to hire scientists. I spoke on our panel the other day about the tobacco industry had a program called Project White Coat, where they would deliberately hire scientists to speak on behalf of the industry, because they knew that if an industry representative said that smoking was fine, many of us wouldn't pass the laugh test. We would know that that was not credible. But if a scientist said it, particularly if it was a distinguished scientist or an avuncular, friendly-looking scientist like Fred Singer, who you saw in the clip, that would be persuasive to many people. So they would recruit scientists. But typically, in almost all cases, with very few exceptions, those scientists, like Fred Singer, in the case of tobacco, they weren't oncologists or public health officials or medical doctors. They were actually mostly physicists. And Fred Singer, who you saw in the film clip, who also worked with Philip Morris Tobacco, he was a rocket scientist. He was actually the proverbial rocket scientist. But what did he know about tobacco and oncology? What did he know about cardiovascular illness? Nothing. But that didn't stop the media from quoting him because he appeared to be credible. So many of the people who defended cigarettes were physicists. Many creationists are chemists. So it's really important to find out what a person's credentials are, and not to just accept when they say, well, I'm a scientist and I know, but find out what kind of a scientist. What was their training in? What did they get their PhD in? And more important, because we do have this phenomenon of the retired scientists who are lonely and sad that they're not still getting the attention that they think they deserve. Although even Claude Legge, by the way, was never a climate scientist. He was an isotope geochemist. Find out what a person's credentials are. What papers have they published in peer-reviewed journals on this topic? And if you ask just that one question, probably 99% of climate deniers and other propagandists will be knocked out of the court. So it isn't just that science comes from scientists, but climate science comes from climate scientists, and oncology comes from oncologists. Now, you may be asking or thinking, well, what about scientists and NGOs or an industry? And this is an important caveat because there are real scientists working in NGOs. I know a lot of people with PhDs in the NGO community. Some of my former students now work for NGOs. And there are real scientists in industry. There's a long history in the United States until pretty recently of large industrial groups like AT&T, Westinghouse, Bell Labs, Eastman Chemicals, running their own internal research shops, and in some cases, those people publish peer-reviewed journals. In fact, Irving Langmuir at General Electric won the Nobel Prize for his work on thin films when he was working for General Electric. So real science can take place in industrial research laboratories, but in that case, the same rule applies. What is their training? What is their PhD in? And most important, what have they published in peer-reviewed journals on this subject? And what data and evidence are they offering now? If they're talking about work of other scientists, which people in NGOs and in industry, of course, have to do, then the question should be, well, what peer-reviewed science are they reviewing? What peer-reviewed science are they quoting? But what you should not do is to quote a lawyer or an economist or ExxonMobil CEO about the science. For years, journalists cited Myron E. Bell, an economist with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, on the reality of anthropogenic climate change, or in his case, the alleged non-reality. 2 years ago, Myron E. Bell became head of the Trump EPA transition team, and I got all these phone calls asking me, have you ever heard of a man named Myron E. Bell? I was like, yeah, I'm afraid so. So for more than a decade, journalists were quoting an economist from an ideologically driven think tank contesting a matter of scientific fact. And I want to say that that was just plain bogus. Journalists, like scientists and historians, should be seeking not balance but accuracy. As a historian, I don't try to write a balanced appraisal of the things I work on. I try to write an accurate appraisal, a true appraisal. And if it means the people I studied did bad things, I'm not going to balance it with some discussion about how nice they are to their dog. It's not relevant for my story, right? And more important, we should never be presenting propaganda and disinformation as counterweights to facts, much less presenting them as facts, or balancing a scientist presenting scientific information with an economist, a lawyer, or a politician. And I want to just give you one other example so you know I'm just not making this up. So a couple of years ago, I was here in Europe during the terrible heat waves in France, 2003, I think it was, yeah. And I watched the BBC coverage of the French heat wave, and they had a climate scientist being interviewed, and next to him was some guy who I'd never even heard of, kind of a weird-looking guy too, saying that this had nothing to do with climate change. So I went online to look up who this guy was, like who even is this person? And he was a man who ran a private company that would sell you a forecast, a weather forecast, up to 364 days in advance. Good, you're laughing, thank you. Okay, so, this was a snake oil salesman, and this was on the BBC. 2 people, a climate scientist and a snake oil salesman. Now, admittedly, again, many of the issues we cover are not so simple, and particularly because many of the stories that we identify as the big science stories, including things like climate change, vaccinations, pesticides, and GMOs, all of these issues evolve into additional dimensions beyond the scientific facts and evidence and theories. For example, they involve economic impacts, individual rights, trade-offs, costs and benefits. And that's all legitimate. And you may want to include discussion of those issues in your story. That's fine. I'm not criticizing that. In fact, I want to say it's perfectly reasonable to interview lawyers, politicians, economists, ethicists, historians, on these extra scientific dimensions. It's fine, in my opinion, to quote someone from a right-wing think tank, like Myron E. Bell, on the policy aspects of climate change. But in that case, he shouldn't be being countered by a scientist. He should be being countered by someone from a left-wing think tank or a left-wing policy perspective, like Greenpeace. In other words, the right-wing think tank is legitimately paired with the left-wing NGO, but it's not legitimately countering science. So the key point here then, obviously, is that we should not conflate a political debate with a scientific one. Or as I said the other day, and some people retweeted, we need to distinguish between something that is controversial and something that is contested. That's not the same thing. Because if we do conflate them, then we are likely to end up, I don't know what that word was supposed to be, aiding and abetting disinformation. I've said this already, but I'll say it again. Real science comes from peer-reviewed scientific journals and peer-reviewed scientific assessments. And one person does not an assessment make. And again, this can be a challenge, I understand. Quoting the IPCC is often difficult. The IPCC doesn't do the best job of boiling down their results into sound bites. I get it that that's difficult. I make my own summaries of the summaries when I talk to reporters. And so it can be tempting to just interview one person and just get one person's view. But the problem is that scientific knowledge never resides in the views of one person or the findings of one paper. Scientific knowledge is about bodies of evidence, the weight of information. And that's why the IPCC in that second assessment report didn't say the president of the IPCC declares. They said the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate. It's always about the weight of evidence, the balance of evidence, and that can be hard sometimes to get your head around, especially an issue like climate change, where the evidence is coming from so many areas, from ice cores in the deep sea and temperature records and coral reefs. It's non-trivial to understand what this balance of evidence is, but that's our job to understand it. That's why we get paid the big bucks. It's also why those assessments are so thick. They're not thick because scientists are undisciplined and can't make up their mind what's important. Well, actually, that might be true. But the point is, there's a lot of evidence, and the evidence is complex, and it comes from lots of different places, and it comes in lots of different forms. These reports, these assessment reports, are attempting to integrate all that we know on a complex issue. Now, if you have a deadline, you will likely be forced to read the synthesis report or the executive summary. And you might well be interested in what other people have to say about it, and that's fine. But if you draw on a synthesis, make sure it's coming from the IPCC and not the NIPCC, which, by the way, if you don't know, stands for the Non-Governmental Panel on Climate Change. And then there's the issue of funding. I think it's always relevant to inquire about funding. Nearly all climate change deniers, in fact, I can't think of a single one I know who's not, maybe, I don't know what Oleg's story is, but certainly in the United States, virtually all climate change deniers are linked to or have funding either directly from the fossil fuel industry or more often indirectly through third-party organizations who then have links to the fossil fuel industry. Yet this information is rarely, if ever, stated in press coverage where these people are quoted. And I know because I pay attention to this, but it's obviously relevant. And I just want to give you one example of here, and then I'll wind up. A famous example that some of you probably heard about was Willie Soon, who taught for many years at the Harvard, well, did research at the Harvard-Smithsonian Observatory, and for years was widely quoted as a legitimate scientist who was skeptical of the scientific consensus. He was a real scientist. He worked at Harvard-Smithsonian. It was actually a soft money job, but that's okay. And he thought that the observed climate change was caused by solar variability. In 2015, and I had known of his work for a long, long time because he was often quoted in the New York Times and other places. In 2015, it was revealed that he had received over $1 million in funding from ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel affiliates, including coal-fired power utilities. And at that point, the New York Times actually wrote an article about it, to their credit, and the New York Times stopped quoting him. That's good. But here's the thing. Look at the image. Look at the background. The Heritage Foundation. He gave a press conference about this, not at Harvard, but at the Heritage Foundation. Soon had a long-standing association with libertarian think tanks, not just the Heritage Foundation, but also the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the home of Myron E. Bell, and also the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, which was the source of the infamous Oregon petition that claimed to have thousands of signatures of scientists who didn't believe in climate change, except it turned out some of the signatures were Charles Darwin and the actor Michael J. Fox and the Spice Girls. And in fact, we wrote about this. We even quoted some of Willie Soon's articles in Merchants of Doubt in 2010. So this had been known for a long time, and yet the media somehow didn't think it was relevant to point out that he was getting all this funding from right-wing think tanks. So why did the media quote him as if he were an independent scientist? Well, I don't know. You have to answer that question. Finally, the last one, it's about reaching out to scientists. Now, you guys are all science journalists, so you probably know this, and you probably have people who you can call, and they will answer the phone. But there is an important additional imbalance in this landscape that I just want to highlight. It's that press officers and agents and publicists and professional disinformers are paid to talk to you. They're paid to answer their email and to pick up the phone. But scientists are paid to do science, and very often they don't want to talk to the media. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the best reason, the most understandable reason, is they want to do their science. So it can often be much easier to get the spin than the science. And so I just want to encourage you to be patient with scientists, to make the effort if you call them once and they don't answer, maybe an email that says, I just need 5 minutes of your time. And if they really won't talk to you, then you need to read their reports and call me if you have questions. And finally then, since our subject is balance and false equivalence, I always find it reassuring to know that actually we're not alone, that this is not a new problem. Somehow I find that makes me feel better. I don't know why, but it does. I always say, like, you know, like you're in a bad place as a historian when you find yourself thinking that, well, it was much worse during the Civil War. But the fact is, this is not a new problem. So I want to leave you with one final thought. The great anthropologist Ashley Montagu, back in the 1950s, when he was accused of being biased, answered, reality has a well-known liberal bias. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So the first question I would like to ask you is, we've talked about climate a lot. Don't you think climate is one of the fields where this false balance has been debunked the most, mostly by your work, I mean partly by your work, but is this not a problem that now has become more acute in other fields of science, such as nutrition, drugs, pesticides?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know because I haven't analyzed it in detail, and Max Boykoff hasn't looked at it for other areas. Actually, it would be a good suggestion to him to look at that. I think you're right that we've certainly made a lot of progress in the area of climate change, and we see much less of this balancing thing than we did 10 years ago. Although even now, you still often see Fred Singer and Myron Ebell being quoted again. And I actually talked to a journalist a little while ago, and I said, why are you quoting Myron Ebell about the science? And he said, well, he's part of the government, you know, it's relevant. And I said, yeah, it's relevant to talk to him about Trump's policies on climate. It's not relevant to, or appropriate to allow him to question and doubt the scientific findings. So it's still there, but I think you're right, it's less, and I hope you're right that it's partly because of my work. You know, I think it varies a lot. One thing I've noticed in the United States is the vaccination question is not covered in a balanced framework in most of the American media. I mean, particularly New York Times, Wall Street Journal, but also Washington Post, but also the Wall Street Journal. Most of the major media, it seems to me, in my reading of it, are pretty clear about the scientific evidence being in favor of vaccine safety, you know, overall, and not causing autism. And I don't see
well, isn't that because there's an alignment between the interests?
Well, exactly. I say, right. That is what I think. I think I've talked about this before. I mean, if the industry were on the side of the anti-vaccination, then I think we'd have a very, very different situation. And a lot of the celebrities who are anti-vaccine, well, they're almost all women, sadly. So I think it's also easy for the media to dismiss them as just like bimbo actresses, you know. Particularly the original one, Jenny McCarthy, who kind of really was a bimbo. Sorry, no, that's not for attribution. Yeah, I don't know, but I think you're right. Certainly in the food area, for sure, we see a tremendous number of cases where nutritionists or scientists are talking about evidence from scientific peer-reviewed studies, and then there'll be a quotation from a representative of Coca-Cola or some other large food group. So yes, I think it definitely is still a problem in the area of food and nutrition, for sure.
Another thing I wanted to ask you is, in some way, your book sort of demonstrates there's not much new under the sun, as these tactics were, invented 50 years ago. Would you say there has been a refinement of these tactics? Would you say there's been an adaptation to the new world, or are we just seeing the same agenda playing over and over again?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I'm shocked how much it seems like it is the same agenda playing over and over again. And in a way, I feel that's depressing because it means we don't learn, right? So a lot of it is the same. And that's, I suppose, as a historian, that's one reason I feel like if we study the history, we can actually understand it, because so much of it is the same. On the other hand, I'm sure there's new things going on with social media that I haven't personally been tracking, and that maybe some other people are. And they certainly are, these folks are certainly smart. They're extremely well-funded. They're very professional. So I'm sure they are thinking through, how to effectively use social media. I mean, I'm sure they're doing that, but I haven't tracked that myself.
Okay. So can I take a look at the audience and see if we have any questions in the audience? Because we only have about 10 minutes left. Okay. So I think we're just going to open it for the Q&A, because I want other people to get a chance to talk with you. So we have 2 microphones. If you can just sort of form lines behind them, and we're ready for your questions.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I'm Frank Hoke with Rockefeller University. You have talked about the connections between the climate change deniers and the tobacco industry people, and I know from reading Merchants of Doubt that there's a connection through to the Cold Warriors, and I wonder if you would talk about that, because I think that deep orientation that comes out in your book is part of understanding this more deeply.
Thank you. Yes, so in Merchants of Doubt, one of the central questions we were trying to answer was, why would distinguished scientists do this? Because the original climate change deniers, Bob Jastrow, Bill Nierenberg, Fred Seitz, Fred Singer, were all distinguished scientists who had had successful scientific careers. And in the case of Fred Seitz, he had been the president of the Rockefeller University and the president of the US National Academy of Sciences. So this was very important for us because, for one thing, it disproved right from the get-go that this had anything to do with scientific illiteracy or public misunderstanding of science. This wasn't the public. This was very high-level professional scientists, and it was not remotely plausible that the former president of the Rockefeller University did not understand climate science. So clearly there was something else going on. And fortunately, we were lucky enough that the documents were rich enough for us to be able to answer that question. And it, as Frank just said, it came out of the Cold War. These were all old Cold Warriors who had worked on US weapons and rocketry programs during the Cold War. They were all deeply anti-communist, and they had a very strong ideological framework, which we used to call neoconservatism, but now it's kind of neoliberalism. But the basic picture is the idea that the free market, that capitalism and free market economics are inextricably linked to democracy. And that if you allow the government to intervene in the marketplace, you're on a slippery slope to socialism. And so they were very strong proponents of people like Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics. They don't quote him directly, but some of the things they say are very redolent of Friedrich von Hayek. So they become anti-environmental because they see environmentalists as a kind of opening wedge, or the camel getting his nose under the door of the tent. And that if you allow environmental regulation to limit the marketplace, then you're kind of, all bets are off. And they write about this in their work. When the Cold War ended, you might have rationally thought that they would be happy and that they would retire and play golf or tennis, which is what I strongly recommend for all retired scientists, particularly physicists. But that's not what happened. Instead, they turned their attention to environmental regulation. And this helps to explain why they got involved in this whole complex set of issues, which on the face of it, what does tobacco have to do with climate change? Seemingly nothing, but for them, everything, because it's about regulation. And that's how the Marshall Institute then, which they found later, makes common cause with the fossil fuel industry, because what they have in common is this opposition to regulation.
Let's take a few more questions. Please, on this side.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. My name is Alejandra Martins. I'm from BBC World Service for Latin America. My question is about attribution and how do you think science journalists are handling attribution? What I'm referring to is when there are constant hurricanes and heat waves, and they always say, well, we cannot say for sure this is caused by climate change, but Michael Mann says that's the wrong question that journalists ask. They should ask, is this more intense or more frequent?
Yeah.
So how do you think we are handling the issues of when hurricanes happen? And
yeah, well, there's been a huge discussion about this, as you probably know, in the last year or so, and scientists have been struggling over this themselves about what the best way to talk about it is. I think this is a really good example of where you need to be willing to translate things into plain English. I mean, I understand all the reasons why climate modelers are reluctant to say climate change caused X, although some are now coming closer to being willing to do that. But if you say climate change made this heat wave 5 times more likely, I mean, in a sense, you are saying it caused it, right? You're saying is that without the climate change component, it's very unlikely that this heat wave would have occurred. I mean, that's another way of saying that it caused it. So, and my philosophy friends and I are now getting deep into this because in a way, it's one of these things that gets down to what do you mean by the word cause, right? And we have many different notions of causation. But it's really interesting. The tobacco industry used to say, well, you can't say that smoking causes cancer because you can't prove that any one cancer was caused by smoking. And yet we know that this is fallacious, right? Because we have enormous, well-documented statistical epidemiological evidence that cancer rates are greatly increased by smoking. So it's really quite analogous. And we do say now that smoking causes cancer. And I think that we now have enough evidence to say that climate change causes extreme weather events.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. Can we have a question from there?
Hi there. Thanks, Naomi, for a wonderful talk. I'm Jonathan Webb from the Australian ABC in Sydney. You made some interesting comments about, in the policy realm, it's obviously not always about the science, not purely about the science. And I'm interested in that. I have some concerns, and this might sound strange in this room, I have some concerns about evidence-based policy, because certainly in some debates in Australia, it's caught on, but at a very sort of superficial level. Everybody claims their policy is evidence-based, when actually there are other reasons, other legitimate reasons for making policy decisions. It might be moral, it might be economical, it might be ideological, and I just wish people would own those reasons for making their policy decisions. I know some people think maybe we should talk about evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy. I'm not sure if that's just semantics, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or advice for journalists covering that space.
It's a great question. I think you're absolutely right, and that was the point I was trying to get at. So clearly, science is just one piece of the puzzle of issues such as what do we do about climate change, right? The science is essential for understanding what the problem is and for articulating its likely magnitude, but science doesn't tell us what to do about climate change, and it doesn't really even tell us what to do about vaccinations, frankly, either, right? I mean, that's a moral question, too. Do we have the right to make people have vaccinations in order to keep everybody else safe, right, if they don't want to do it themselves? So many of these questions do involve questions of common good, and so ethics and morals will always be part of these debates. And I agree with you completely. I think the idea of evidence-based policy is often an excuse for actually not confronting the moral, ethical, political, economic, social, you name it, dimensions of these problems. So actually, I think your idea about the evidence-informed policy is a good one, and I think it's not just semantics. I think to talk about evidence-informed policy would acknowledge that the evidence is clearly a crucial component, but the scientific evidence is only one aspect of complex scientific claims. And frankly, I would respect Myron Ebell if he said, yeah, I know climate change is real, but I just really don't agree with the idea of having a cap-and-trade system. Great, then we could have an honest debate about it. But instead, we're in this dishonest place where these people claim that the problem isn't really true or it's not as bad as scientists say, and then you get stuck because you actually can't discuss the solution because you're stuck in this quagmire of arguing about the evidence, which is in his case, in Ebell's case, that's what he wants.
So, I apologize to the people who have more questions. They're going to have to come up to the stage and ask them individually to Naomi, because we have to conclude the session so as not to shift the whole schedule of the day. Thanks so much for coming, Naomi.
Yeah,
Thank you for your questions, and see you soon.